Let's go back to France, late 1789. Dissatisfaction with the ancien regime, the old way of doing things, with nobles and peasants and not much in between, has reached a breaking point. A poor economy, failing harvests, and no relief from a weak and spineless king has led the Third Estate, the commoners, to lose faith in the system entirely. Inflammatory news articles and pamphlets stir up paranoia and fear, prompting drastic measures. With the storming of the Bastille prison, a 4-hour insurrection led by French peasants in July, 94 people are dead. But that's a small price to pay to overturn a corrupt, tyrannical government. That's a small price to pay for liberty. And it is a small price, really, when you consider that over the next 4 years, as many as 50,000 more would die for the cause. Let's fix that. Hello, I'm LaFountaine, and you're listening to History Fix, where I discuss lesser-known true stories from history you won't be able to stop thinking about. If you're listening to this right now, you should know that this is part 2 of a 2-part episode on the French Revolution. So if you missed last week's episode, part 1, go back and listen to that first. This one won't make a ton of sense unless you listen to part 1 first. Last week, I talked about the climate leading up to the revolution. Figuratively, the situation, what was happening in France that led to such drastic measures. A failing social hierarchy, a wishy-washy, indecisive king, a plummeting economy, crop failure, skyrocketing bread prices, and of course, a runaway, sensational media pumping out doom and gloom paranoia stories and drumming up public fear and panic. And I ended last week's episode right where this one began, with the storming of the Bastille and the destruction of the ancien regime, the old order. And so that is where we will pick up today. But first, as promised, I released a mini fix on Wednesday about Marie Antoinette. There's so much more to her that I'm not able to cram into these 2 episodes, so I needed to give her her own fix. Here's a sneak peek. If you lived in late 18th century Paris and you picked up a newspaper or a pamphlet from a street vendor as you made your way home down the Champs-Élysées, you'd very likely see one name in particular printed on it: Marie Antoinette. And I can almost guarantee you that the news would not be good. After marrying the heir to the French throne, the future King Louis XVI in 1770, all of France pretty quickly came to loathe their new future queen. Sort of. They love-hated her. They followed her fashion trends, and they hungrily gobbled up any news of her. She was an influencer before that was a thing. But as with many influencers today, people also loved to hate her. And also like today, a love-hate relationship this strong, this hungry, is fed, fueled, and fanned by sensational media willing to print anything at all about her that readers will gobble up. Didn't matter if it was true, didn't matter if it was damaging, didn't matter if it caused the very country to come crashing down around them. Let's fix that. You can listen to the rest of that over on patreon.com/historyfixpodcast. The link is always in the description. Lots of awesome extra content there. So the Bastille has been stormed. The king, Louis XVI, has been marched to Paris. They've abolished the feudal system. They've put forth this declaration claiming liberty and equality and the protection of private property, the right to stand up to oppression, all good things. And they're working on reworking the government entirely. And it's going well. At first, sort of. I mean, it's not too crazy, at least. They have some good ideas. It needed to be reworked. It was a broken, failing system, and while different social classes had different ideas about how to fix that, they did all agree that it was obviously a broken, failing system. They're down to keep the king. They basically just want to switch it from an absolute monarchy, where the king has all the power, to a constitutional monarchy, where the king is more of a symbolic figure, and the country was actually controlled by elected assemblies who represented all the people, a lot more democratic. So they didn't like storm the Bastille and then chop off Louis's head the next day. No, they were down to let him stay and be part of it. For a few years, actually. For a couple of years, they're trying to work this out and make this work with a king still, but just a fairer form of government, equal representation, checks and balances, all that good stuff. And even though that all sounds very reasonable, Louis is having a really hard time with it. Encyclopedia Britannica says, quote, "This regime might have worked if the king had really wanted to govern with the new authorities. But Louis XVI was weak and vacillating and was the prisoner of his aristocratic advisors," end quote. He actually tries to flee the country in June of 1791, but they stop him and his family and bring them back to Paris. And this is a huge blow to whatever remnants are left of his authority in France. But they still don't chop off his head. Not yet. They just kind of put up with him for now. One solution they come up with for the financial problems is to take the land that had been owned by the Roman Catholic Church. Remember, the clergy was the first estate. They held the most land. They decide to take this land from the church and sell it to the people. This is how they're going to pay off their debt and climb out of the financial hole that they're in. But they weren't selling the land fast enough to pay back the creditors. Duh, because everything's super expensive and no one has any money. So to remedy this, to stimulate these land purchases, they start printing a new type of paper money called assignats, which means assignment. And it's basically a bond backed by the value of the land that they took from the church. And I'm not going to pretend to know what that means or how that works, but that's what it was, apparently. So they're putting these assignats into circulation, this new paper money, and the hope is that the people will use the assignats to buy the land from the government. And then afterwards, after they sell the land, they're going to burn all the assignats to get them out of circulation. They're just a temporary measure. Temporary money. But then they don't. They don't burn them a lot of the time, and they keep circulating. And this leads to a lot of public mistrust. And the public mistrust leads anyone with assignats to try to spend them as fast as they can, because who knows if they're even going to be worth anything soon. So the assignats are flying around, and this causes what economic history professor Dr. Louis Rouanet calls hyperinflation, the first modern hyperinflation. Which, like, duh, you print more money, you introduce more money, more bills, the value of each of those bills is going to go down. So now the money's worth less. Now you need more of it to buy things. So the prices go up. According to Dr. Rouanet, prices start to go up by 50% each month. They thought they couldn't afford bread before. By 1795, inflation is at 3,500%. For some context, U.S. inflation is at 2.6% right now, which makes me feel a whole lot better. On top of all that, they've taken all this land from the church. Now they try to reorganize the church, which the Pope in Rome and the French clergy are not into. They're like, no way. And this begins a divide between the church and the new revolutionary government that will rear its ugly head very soon. A lot of the clergy leave France, along with some nobility who aren't feeling this upheaval of the old way. It was great for them before, right? Why mess with a good thing? They flee the country and hole up near the northeastern border, where they arm themselves and seek help from the rest of Europe, prepared to go back in with support and reclaim what was once theirs. But, like I said last week, Europe's not interested in getting involved in this mess. France can do whatever, just leave them out of it. That is until this new France starts overstepping its borders. It reclaims the territory of Avignon in 1791. And Europe is like, okay, we don't like that. And then France declares war against Austria in April of 1792. Now remember, Austria is where Marie Antoinette is from. And what's interesting about this declaration of war is that it's sort of supported by both sides in France. The revolutionary government thinks all these counter-revolutionary runaway clergy and nobility are holed up there, gathering support to storm back in and retake France. And so they want to squash that. They also hope to spread their revolutionary ideas to the rest of Europe. But Even Louis and Marie are down with a war on Austria. They're hoping Austria will come in and set things right, restore his authority as king. Either that or rescue them and get them the heck out of there. Marie's brother, Leopold II, is the current Holy Roman Emperor, after all. Certainly, he will come rescue them if they force him to get involved. And although France started this war, it's not going well. To the delight, I'm sure, of Louis and Marie, Prussia gets involved, and together Prussia and Austria invade France quite handily and start advancing towards Paris. So, at this point, July of 1792, 3 whole years after the triumphant storming of the Bastille, I have to say that things are kind of worse than ever. The economy is somehow even worse than it was before, hyperinflation, and they're losing the war they picked with Austria and Prussia. The new government is floundering. None of their ideas are working. The king is not cooperating with their idea of a constitutional monarchy. And a particular group of revolutionaries called the Jacobins decides that they have had enough. And this is a much less reasonable group. These guys are radical revolutionaries, and they will stop at nothing to forge the France that they want. In August of 1792, the Jacobins storm the Tuileries Palace, where the royal family is, and arrest them. The Tuileries Palace is gone now. It was burnt down in the 1800s, but it used to be right next to the Louvre in Paris. So this radical revolutionary group rises up and arrests the king. They are done messing around with this dude. They imprison the royal family, and then they start doing their thing. And their thing is scary. This part of the revolution is referred to as the Reign of Terror, and for good reason. After imprisoning the royal family, they abolished the monarchy altogether. He had a chance. He blew it. He's done. And then they round up the remaining clergy and the nobility, and they throw them in prison too, under suspicion of being counter-revolutionary against the revolution, whether they actually were or not, just for being in the first and second estates, pretty much. And the journalists, the press is having a field day. They are fueling this new radical pandemonium, spreading rumors that the aristocrats and the priests are now hatching anti-revolutionary plans from prison. The journalists start rallying people to action. One in particular, named Jean-Paul Marat, urged his readers to, quote, go to the Abbaye to seize priests and especially the officers of the Swiss guards and their accomplices and run a sword through them, end quote. And it was incitement like this from the media that led the Jacobin radicals to go to the prisons and start massacring the clergy and the nobility that they had imprisoned there, starting on September 2nd, 1792. According to history professor Christine Adams at St. Mary's College of Maryland, quote, the first people murdered were counter-revolutionary priests in the process of being transported to the Abbaye prison, the place Marat had singled out. Priests associated with counter-revolutionary forces, because of the Catholic Church's implacable opposition to the revolution, would be among the major victims of the attack. The killings quickly spread to other prisons, where self-styled patriots sought to eliminate those involved in treasonous plots against the nation. By the time the slaughter ended on September 6th, somewhere between 1,100 and 1,400 people had died. Only about 1/3 of those killed were political prisoners or conspirators against the government. The majority were common criminals, many locked up for minor offenses, end quote. And quite a few of those were also innocent women and children. She goes on, quote, however, the September Massacres who carried out the massacres, many of them National Guard troops and fédérés from the provinces preparing to head off to the war front, considered themselves true patriots. They were firmly convinced that they were performing work essential to the safety of the country. A number of journalists and politicians praised their actions in the immediate aftermath of the murders, but complicity in the September Massacres eventually became a source of shame. A number of French politicians would be accused of either encouraging the massacres or not doing enough to stop them. Even today, historians find it difficult to determine exactly what role certain politicians played in the massacres. In some cases, because they took steps to hide their role from history as it became more problematic to be associated with them. end quote. But at the time, it was not problematic. It was praised and encouraged. These people were saving France. They were killing innocent priests and unrelated bystanders, but they thought they were saving France. And people rallied over this. Nationalism grew, and men flocked to join the army fighting Austria and Prussia on the front lines. And these new forces, spurred on by the September Massacres, started to turn things around for France. They start to push Prussia and Austria back. Leopold is no longer coming to the rescue. Louis is put on trial, convicted of treason, and executed by guillotine in January of 1793. And this is like a bomb has gone off in Europe. France has clearly lost its mind. England, Spain, Portugal get involved in the war. Meanwhile, civil war breaks out all across France because not everyone is on board with this, understandably. They are massacring mostly innocent people now. One woman in particular, Charlotte Corday from Normandy, is so horrified by the September Massacres and the fact that they were prompted by journalists, specifically Jean-Paul Marat, that she decides to pay him a visit. This is nuts, you guys. Charlotte goes to Paris for an interview with Marat about a year after the massacres. She's agreed to tell him the names of some counter-revolutionaries that she knows. So she goes to see him for their interview. He's in a bathtub when she gets there, like legit. He shows up to the interview naked in the bathtub. What? And I find this infuriating because this dude would not be interviewing a man while naked in a bathtub. This is some weird patriarchy BS right here. But Charlotte is not rattled. She sits next to the bathtub and she tells him the names that she's promised. And he jots them down and he assures her that they will be guillotined. And then she proceeds to pull out a knife and stab him in the heart while he sits naked in his bathtub. Why do I love this story so much? She's arrested on the spot and, of course, guillotined herself. The radical government does not stop, though, after chopping off the king's head or Charlotte Corday's head. They start chopping off everyone's heads. Anyone who could be even halfway seen as a threat, as counter-revolutionary, they chop off their heads. A documented 300,000 people are arrested and 17,000 of them are executed this way over the next 10 months. But tens of thousands more die in prison and during other random massacres that are taking place. Marie Antoinette is still alive. For now, she's imprisoned. Her husband has been executed. Her best friend, the Princess de Lamballe, gets dismembered in the street. They chopped her up into pieces and paraded her body parts through Paris. And you guys, I don't care how great you think your cause is, that is messed up. No great, noble new government would ever do that. That's a serious red flag. Another red flag, they change the calendar. They get rid of Christianity, so therefore they need a whole new calendar. Because we, the whole world, we use a Christian calendar. The years are counting up from the birth of Jesus. It's the year of our Lord, 2024 right now. So they have to do away with that. They started over from September 1792 when the revolution was officially proclaimed, when the radicals took over and massacred the priests. That is no longer 1792. That's now year 0. 1793 is year 1, 1794 is year 2, and so on. Bold move. They also change it from a 7-day week to a 10-day week. So there are 3 10-day weeks or decades each month. And they changed the names of the days. No Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. It's now Primidi, Duodi, Tridi, and so on. And they changed the names of the months, too. They actually get a poet to do this. So they're kind of eerily pretty. Floréal, Fructidor, Thermidor, Brumaire, Vendémiaire. They're just redoing everything. And they're fighting off half of Europe. And they're chopping everyone's heads off, including Marie Antoinette, in October of 1793. She was 37 years old. And fun fact, her last words were, "Pardon me, sir, I did not do it on purpose." But she's not talking about the treason charges. She says that because she accidentally stepped on the executioner's foot as she walked up to the guillotine. Her last words, she's being polite, apologizing to the man who's about to chop off her head. And I think that says a lot about her. Not about the Marie Antoinette people thought she was, the Marie the newspapers created, but about the real Marie Antoinette, the one who takes the time to apologize to her executioner for stepping on his foot. And of course, please do listen to the mini-fix for more about the real Marie Antoinette and more about her execution. So this radical revolution, this reign of terror phase, gets started with a lot of popular support and nationalism, but by the summer of 1794, after they've been chopping off heads for a while, support starts to wane. Professor Adams says, quote, "It had come to be seen by opponents and even some earlier supporters as too brutal and too indiscriminate," end quote. Which, you think? And this is especially true after the passing of a law, the Law of 22 Prairial, which is June 10th, on the new calendar, that limited the ability of the accused to defend themselves. So it made it a lot easier to arrest people and chop off their heads, and there was not a whole lot they could do about it, even if they were innocent. And it led to a major increase in the number of people who were being executed. So this was a scary law, for obvious reasons, even for some supporters of the radical Jacobin government. Now, one of the main guys who passed this law, and a key player during the Reign of Terror, was Committee of Public Safety member Maximilien Robespierre. Robespierre often gets blamed for the whole Reign of Terror, probably unfairly so, but also he made his bed. At this point, by the summer of 1794, a lot of the original members of the new government who helped usher in the revolution have had their heads chopped off. Even they have had their heads chopped off. Usually because Robespierre and co. accused them of not being committed enough to the cause, as if that's even a measurable thing. So as one would expect to happen when you start chopping off your own side's heads, they start getting paranoid amongst themselves. When is Robespierre going to accuse them of not being committed enough and chop off their heads? And now they can't even fight it because of this law he passed that says they can't fight it. Professor Adams writes, quote, "This fear was heightened on July 26th, when Robespierre gave a speech before the National Convention, in which he suggested, ominously for those listening, that there were traitors within the National Convention itself whom he was ready to expose. This brought together a group of legislators, fearful for their own lives, who put aside their own differences to take Robespierre down. These men, called the Thermidorians, drawn from the name of the month Thermidor in the revolutionary calendar, launched their offensive in a series of dramatic speeches before the National Convention on July 27th, 9 Thermidor. Their accusations led to the arrest and swift trial of Robespierre, with his two closest associates and his brother. The four men went to the guillotine the next day, done in by the laws that they themselves had helped pass." End quote. So, can we all agree that this is an absolute disaster so far? They're at war with half of Europe and themselves, the economy is worse than ever, and they've just executed one of their main guys. And their reason for executing him was that he had gone too far with the Reign of Terror. But to say that, to admit that Robespierre was wrong to support the executions of 17,000 people, they couldn't avoid the dangerous fact that they were complicit in it too. How do you condemn your own leader, execute him, and not go down with him? Well, very carefully, it seems. Professor Adams writes, quote, "Now with Robespierre out of the way, the men who brought him down needed to find a way to convince the French public that it was Robespierre and his small group of followers who were responsible for the excesses of the terror, not them, and at the same time to reestablish a stable government. No easy task," end quote. But the media, the press, the very thing that helped spur on their revolution is not helping them. Adams says, quote, "A pamphlet called Le Coup de Robespierre, Robespierre's Tale, suggested that while Robespierre's head had been cut off, his radical Jacobin followers were still active." French legislators continued to investigate and condemn those responsible for the worst excesses of the terror. Some of them were exiled, others executed. Those held accountable included some of the men responsible for taking down Robespierre, but many more evaded responsibility and helped shape the next government. End quote. But this is why history has painted Robespierre as the villain behind the Reign of Terror. Because these men, his own men, who turned on him and took him down, went to great lengths to try to paint him as the sole villain behind the Reign of Terror in order to save their own necks. So the Jacobins are donezo, and they're followed by a group of moderate Republicans. But while these guys are definitely not trying to reinstate the monarchy or anything like that, they also haven't fully bought into the idea of democracy. They don't really trust it. They don't trust the democratic process. And this causes them to overturn what they thought of as problematic election results in 1797 and again in 1798. And that's a problem. When you start questioning democracy, when you start questioning whether or not, for example, elections are rigged, and you start poking holes in the process, whether warranted or not, that's a problem. And we know this because it happened in France. Adams explains, quote, "These actions lessened the French public's commitment to democratic institutions, convincing them that all politicians were corrupt and self-serving. The cynicism and distrust of the directorial regime opened the path for the young and charismatic general Napoleon Bonaparte to come to power in a coup on the 18th Brumaire, which is November 9th, 1799. End quote. Okay, and if you aren't drawing parallels yet between that situation and current politics in the US, then I won't draw them for you, but my mind certainly goes there. Who do we know who pokes holes in democracy, convincing the public that elections are rigged and politicians are corrupt and self-serving? Napoleon Bonaparte. Who did you think I was going to say? But guess who's really corrupt and self-serving? Yeah, Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon, where to even start? He was an incredibly complicated historical figure, and he deserves his own episode for sure, which he'll probably get someday. But ultimately, he was the end result of the French Revolution. So, was he what they wanted? Was he what they were hoping to get out of all that upheaval and bloodshed? Was he worth it? Sort of. Like I said, Napoleon was very complicated. Historians are pretty split on whether he was a hero or a tyrant. Incredibly dynamic character. On the one hand, he did a lot of really great things for France, things that shaped what France is to this day, what the world is today. When he rose to power, France was in absolute shambles, without a leader, and he filled that power vacuum, as men like Napoleon tend to do. He got rid of feudalism in France once and for all. He established legal equality and religious tolerance. He legalized divorce, and he introduced what's come to be called the Napoleonic Code of Laws that have been adopted in many other countries around the world, or some form inspired by them at least. The Napoleonic Code basically got rid of birthright privilege. Don't care who your daddy is, you work for it like the rest of us. It said that government jobs should be awarded on merit alone. So he's really cracking down on nepotism here. It also granted religious freedom, and it just established laws in general, a system, because France was basically lawless at this point. He also did a lot for education, establishing the modern public education system that is still used in France. He established the Bank of France and a tax code that finally brought that 3,500% inflation under control and eliminated the national debt within a year that they had been grappling with for decades. And he was undoubtedly a military genius, considered by most to be one of the greatest military commanders of all time. His campaigns are still studied in military schools worldwide. They're like, what the heck was this guy doing? We need to be doing that. According to a 5-minute history article, Israeli military historian and theorist Martin van Creveld describes Napoleon as, quote, the most competent human being who ever lived, end quote. What is this, like a Dos Equis commercial? The most interesting man in the world. Anyway, I know I listed a lot of great things there that he did, and he did, but you should also know, let me balance that a little bit, he also reintroduced slavery in the French colonies. He allowed rich people to dodge military conscription, and he did nothing at all to promote gender equality. So yeah, there's a dark side. And the real dark side is that he was kind of a tyrant. The reason he was able to achieve all of these things, good or bad or whatever, is because he seized complete control over France in a pretty dangerous way. And while he did some good with it, it was still dangerous. Professor Rafe Blaufarb, director of the Institute on Napoleon and the French Revolution at Florida State University, says, quote, "He was a political animal. He loved power. He was motivated by the quest to have power, to hold power, and to exercise power. He liked to dominate everyone around him. This is a bit of his downfall in foreign policy because he wasn't very good at coming up with compromises, giving a little to enemies in order to live in peace in the future. He had to dominate everything that got in his way. It was Napoleon in charge or no one. And that's because he loved power. He was consumed by the desire for power and he wanted to exercise it. How do we know? We have 70,000 letters that he wrote in which he expresses some pretty harsh, dominating sentiments, sometimes toward conquered people and opponents. We also have memoirs and testimony from people who were in his life. For example, generals and the people in his imperial court. And they talk about this. Napoleon was in charge. He was incredibly dominating and powerful. He exuded a kind of influence. He could look at people, apparently, give them a piercing look, and they would crumble. He was a man of power." End quote. After Napoleon rigged an election in 1804 in order to make himself emperor, he attempted to portray Roman Emperor Julius Caesar at his coronation with a golden laurel wreath crown. He also wears a Roman toga in the relief carving of him in his tomb. So, a bit grandiose. He used propaganda to spread this grandiose image of himself and censored any media that would tarnish it, bringing the number of newspapers in Paris from 60 down to just 4. He spied on people, like Big Brother style. That 5-minute history article says, quote, "The grandiose image Napoleon created for himself, as well as the tightly controlled society that he established once in power, was a model for a totalitarian state that Hitler and Stalin would follow with such ruthlessness in the next century. Those who defied him were crushed under his iron hand. Joseph Fouché, the head of the secret police, extended Emperor Napoleon's reach into every aspect of French society through a vast network of spies. Jean-Paul Berthaud, a professor emeritus of history at La Sorbonne in Paris and a specialist on the French Revolution and military history, explained what life was like under Napoleon's iron rule. Quote, "You go to a salon, there's a spy. You go to a brothel, there's a spy. You go to a restaurant, there's a spy. Everywhere there are spies of the police. Everyone listens to what you say. It's impossible to express yourself unless Napoleon wants you to." End quote. And what about all those military victories? Well, on the flip side of that, a lot of people died for him. Over 1 million Frenchmen, and double that if we're counting throughout all of Europe. An ill-advised invasion of Russia in 1812 alone cost the lives of some 500,000 of his men. During his Egyptian campaign, he ordered plague-stricken men in his army to be poisoned because they were slowing him down, and then abandoned 30,000 of his men in Egypt after a failed siege and secretly headed back to France, where he was given a hero's welcome. And while these men would do anything for him, he famously once said, quote, "I care only for people who are useful to me, and so long as they are useful." End quote. So was Napoleon a hero or a tyrant? British historian Andrew Roberts sides towards hero, writing in his book Napoleon, A Life, quote, "The ideas that underpin our modern world, meritocracy, equality before the law, property rights, religious toleration, modern secular education, sound finances, and so on, were championed, consolidated, codified, and geographically extended by Napoleon. To them, he added a rational and efficient local administration, an end to rural banditry, the encouragement of science and of the arts, the abolition of feudalism, and the greatest codification of laws since the fall of the Roman Empire." End quote. But former French Prime Minister Lionel Jospin seems to feel differently, saying in a Newsweek article, quote, "Napoleon was an obvious failure, bad for France and the rest of Europe. When he was shown the door, France was isolated, beaten, occupied, dominated, hated, and smaller than before. What's more, Napoleon smothered the forces of emancipation awakened by the French and American revolutions and enabled the survival and restoration of monarchies." End quote. Pretty crazy that you can be both. Yet another reminder that things in this life are not so black and white. So that's what happened to France, but what happened to the Bourbon family? I mean, we know Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were executed, but what about the rest of the royal family? Well, they had 4 children. 2 of them died in childhood of natural causes before all of this. The other 2, Louis and Marie-Therese, were imprisoned when the radical Jacobins took over. Louis died of medical complications in prison at the age of 10, after being subjected to abuse and mistreatment and forced to make false allegations of incest against his mother that directly led to her execution. Marie-Therese, the oldest child, was released from prison after the madness of the Reign of Terror had ended and went to live with family in Austria, where she would go on to do what her family does and marry her cousin, named, you guessed it, Louis. She would live out most of her life in exile. Louis XVI's 2 younger brothers, Louis and Charles, escaped and survived, and each actually had a turn to rule France after the fall of Napoleon in 1815 during the Bourbon Restoration that temporarily revived the monarchy, but that would not last very long. So now we come to the part where I try to make some sense of all this. I told you at the start last week that the French Revolution is a Pandora's box for history lovers. Good and bad just kind of go out the window entirely. It's an ethical nightmare. Is it okay to do bad things to get good results? Is it okay to spread false information if it helps you achieve ends that you feel are better for the world? Is it okay to kill people to achieve those ends? Where do we draw the line? I obviously can't answer that for you, but I will point out some takeaways from the French Revolution, some things we could possibly learn from it that might help us come to grips with our current situation today and moving forward. And these 4 takeaways come from that article by Christine Adams, professor of history at St. Mary's College. It's linked in the description. The first is disinformation, rumors, fake news. This was a huge part of the French Revolution. Louis granted freedom of the press, and they had a field day. It didn't matter if what they were printing was true or not. If people were reading it, if they were buying their pamphlets, they would write it. Or in the case of journalists like Jean-Paul Marat, if it roused people to actions that he believed were necessary, he would write it. The media spread false information about counter-revolutionaries secretly plotting in prison that led to the September Massacres. They spread information about rigged elections that destroyed the public's trust in democracy, leading to the rise of a potentially very dangerous tyrant, Napoleon Bonaparte. And they spread false information about important figures, most notably Marie Antoinette, that destroyed the reputations of the royal family, leading to public outcry for their heads to be chopped off of their bodies. Marie Antoinette never said, "Let them eat cake." And yet that quote, the most famous quote she never said, was incredibly damning. She was accused of having affairs she never had. She was accused of a scandal involving an exorbitantly expensive diamond necklace that she had nothing to do with. All that's in the mini-fix on Patreon. Her character was assassinated by fake news. And it mattered. It wasn't just her reputation. It was France. Journalists convinced the people that she was everything wrong with France. The media is incredibly powerful. And back then it was just newspapers and pamphlets you had to go buy on a street corner somewhere, intentionally seek out. Today it's so much more than that. It's everywhere. We have it in our pocket at all times. You can pull out your phone and open pretty much any app and you are hit with it immediately. It's powerful and it's dangerous when it isn't wielded responsibly. Another takeaway Professor Adams points out The people behind the September Massacres and the Reign of Terror, where they're just ruthlessly murdering people, mostly innocent people, these guys do not believe that they are doing anything wrong. Actually, they are convinced that they are doing good. Adams says, quote, "In a context of deep political divisions, widespread disinformation, economic crisis, and social unrest, overheated rhetoric can lead to violence. Groups of individuals who commit these violent acts see themselves as honorable defenders of a cause, not as a violent mob," end quote. And I'm reminded of the insurrection at the U.S. Capitol building on January 6th, 2021. It was a violent mob. Violent mobs are bad, right? How can so many people genuinely think that that wasn't bad? Because they view these insurrectionists as, like Professor Adams said, honorable defenders of a cause. Perspective. Number 3, quote, "Rarely is one individual solely responsible for instigating an attack on democratic institutions and a regime of violence," end quote. Adams talks about Robespierre, how Robespierre got all the blame for the Reign of Terror, but how he was actually just one cog in that machine. He was the face of it, the one everyone saw, but there were many more people involved. It's easy to cast all the blame on one person, to hate that one guy, that one politician, but you have to factor in the system that holds him up, the shadowy faces behind him making it all happen. They are just as dangerous. Professor Adams concludes in her article with takeaway number 4, which is a bit of a gut punch, honestly. Quote, "When politicians question and undermine the results of elections, citizens become more cynical and less committed to democracy, which is enormously damaging in the long run," end quote. Are elections rigged? I don't know. I don't think so. But if you think so, then I don't know. Go deal with it, like privately or something. Stop showing all of your cards. Stop stirring up public fear and distrust in democracy. If you're going to publicly poke holes in democracy, then prepare for the public to set their sights on to accept possibly a totally different form of government. A monarchy, a dictatorship, dare I say, communism? I mean, if you're all for democracy, then stop attacking democracy. Adams warns, quote, "Our politicians should keep in mind that while undercutting faith in democratic institutions may sometimes lead to short-term political gain, the long-term effects are profoundly damaging," end quote. I'm not trying to say that America's about to erupt into revolution and another reign of terror and start chopping people's heads off. I'm not. The situation is completely different here than it was in France in 1789. Like, we're doing great compared to how things were in France. I feel better about everything. We're golden. So it's apples and oranges. But there are some eerie lines that can be drawn, especially with the involvement of sensationalized media, especially with the undermining of election results, especially with excusing violent mobs as honorable defenders of a cause. There are important lessons we can learn from their mistakes. Propaganda, brainwashing, is subtle. It's a long game. You think you're in control. You think for yourself, make up your own mind, stick to your principles, your morals, your convictions. You think that even while they snake their way into your psyche undetected. You think that even as the blades drop, as the heads roll, as you run your sword through a priest, as you torture an innocent child, you're not a bad person. You're a defender of the cause. But you only think that because they wanted you to. Thank you all so very much for listening to History Fix. I hope you found this story interesting, and maybe you even learned something new. Be sure to follow my Instagram at HistoryFixPodcast to see some images that go along with this episode and to stay on top of new episodes as they drop. I'd also really appreciate it if you would rate and follow History Fix on whatever app you're using to listen, and help me spread the word by telling a few friends about it. That'll make it much easier to get your next fix. Information used in this episode was sourced from biography.com, History.com, Encyclopedia Britannica, the U.S. Office of the Historian, Chateau de Versailles, the University of Texas, Napoleon.com, Age of Revolutions, The Collector, Newsweek, and 5 Minute History. As always, links to these sources can be found in the show notes.